Some of the best stories are rarely told tales of survival, world-changing successes, heroic deeds. The daring, cunning, and sometimes a bit quirky. These are the stories of real people, some of them ordinary and some virtually unknown for their extraordinary deeds. Feed your imagination and learn from the best and sometimes the worst in these amazing tales. Everyone has a story. This is episode 22, Reportedly Crazy. Investigative journalists are intrepid souls, often willing to boldly go where no man, or in this case, woman, has gone before. Liz was only 21 in 1885 when she began writing for the Pittsburgh Dispatch. 2 years later, shortly after the popular success of Jules Verne's science fiction novel Around the World in 80 Days, she moved to the big city to write for the New York World newspaper. As a stunt, the newspaper's editor wanted to show that one really could go around the world in 80 days. Liz was young, but she'd already completed some of the most high-profile assignments for any journalist of her day, including one that would have tested even the hardiest of reporters. Making an arduous trip around the world was both logistically problematic and dangerous in those days, especially for a woman. They thought she was crazy to do this alone, and maybe she was. After all, she had spent 10 days in a mental institution on a small island in New York City. She had only 2 days' notice before boarding the ship that would carry her on the first stage of her journey. Liz marked the very second they first set sail from New Jersey. It was exactly 30 seconds from when the clock struck 9:40 p.m. on November 14, 1889. Never having sailed on a ship before, seasickness overtook her rather quickly. Besides feeling nauseated, she had to contend with the stares of fellow passengers as she heaved over the railing, letting loose her stomach into the wild waves below. The only remedy for poor Liz would be to close herself in her cabin, hoping to sleep it off. 22 hours later, there was a knock on her cabin door. It was the captain. She awoke and answered, to his relief, for he had begun to fear that she had died. Relief had come to her as well. Her long sleep had allowed her troubled stomach to recover. Liz not only spent the rest of her 7 days across the Atlantic eating heartily, she also made friends with some of her more cordial shipmates. On the next leg of her journey, through Paris by train, Liz couldn't resist making a side trip to meet the French writer Jules Verne in person. He'd been eager to meet Liz, and since his work had been the inspiration for her adventure, there was no way she could refuse. The famous author and his wife greeted Liz at the train station and treated her as a cherished friend. When they parted ways, he told Liz that if she beat the record, he would applaud her with both hands. With that encouragement, she set off across Europe. The journey exposed Liz to a colorful and amusing cast of characters who crossed her path. While sailing from Italy to Egypt, false rumors spread that she was a rich American heiress. One man was so gold-struck over her imagined wealth that he proposed to her immediately. Even if she hadn't been determined to make this trip without a companion, she was no fool. Liz did partake of some rich culture, though. Exotic cuisines, interesting fashions, fascinating locations, and even some cultural faux pas punctuated her trip. But it was on Christmas Day that she received the most surprising news of her journey. Liz had been in Hong Kong, where she was treated like a celebrity, including being taken for a ride with the finest team of ponies on the island. When it was time to make her travel arrangements onward to Japan, she reported to the office of the Oriental and Occidental Steamship Company. The agent assisting her noted that she was going to lose her race. Lose it? I don't understand. What do you mean? She demanded. Aren't you having a race around the world? He asked casually. Yes, quite right, she replied. But she informed him that she wasn't racing against a person. She was only in a race against time. Time? I don't think that's her name. Her? She repeated. Liz was beginning to think that he was the one who'd lost it. His mind, that is. But his next statement gave her pause. Yes, the other woman. She's going to win. She left here 3 days ago. Liz was floored. She had no idea anyone else was gunning to beat not only Verne's fictional record, but her as well. Cosmopolitan, a rival publication, had dispatched a competitor in the opposite direction on the same day Liz departed. With this revelation, there was no time to lose getting aboard a ship to cross the Pacific back toward the United States. Well, except first, She first had to buy a monkey to take with her. Showered with flowers and congratulations, the nation celebrated as Liz stepped onto the dock at San Francisco. She was about to complete the last leg of this trip of a lifetime, speeding across the country in a single-car train chartered by the New York World newspaper. She looked out the window, watching the blur of planes across Middle America, soaking in a glorious ride that she felt was worthy of a queen. Her train pulled into Jersey City at 3:51 p.m. on January 25th of 1890. Liz had circumnavigated the globe in 72 days, 6 hours, 11 minutes, and 14 seconds. Stepping off the train, Liz took off her cap and cheered along with the crowd who came out to greet her. She was finally home again. Liz, the investigative journalist and now world traveler, had not only beat Jules Verne's fictional Phileas Fogg by rounding the world in less than 80 days, she also beat her surprise competitor by 4 days. Liz wrote of her adventures by steamship, train, horse, donkey, and rickshaw in her own book, Around the World in 72 Days. Crazy as it seems, what Liz was most remembered for was the time she spent a few years earlier in a New York lunatic asylum. In fact, that's why she got the job at the newspaper. She didn't have any money and was willing to take on any assignment they would give her. The editor at the New York World newspaper challenged her to come up with a sensational story to attract readers and prove herself as a detective reporter. Liz faked insanity to get herself admitted to the women's lunatic asylum on Blackwell's Island in New York's East River. She stopped bathing and brushing her teeth. She practiced for hours in front of a mirror to hold faraway expressions that made her look mentally unstable. Next, Liz posed as a Cuban immigrant and took up residence at a women's boarding house. There, she would stay up all night to give herself the wild, wide-eyed look of someone who appeared psychologically disturbed. She made up long rants against women boarding there and accused them of things that never happened. The other ladies were so scared that someone finally notified the police. Liz was taken into custody, and a judge had her sent to the asylum. Liz did such an effective job of acting the part that other newspapers began reporting sensationally about the arrest of this wild woman. This asylum was notorious for the deplorable conditions and inhumane treatment of patients. Charles Dickens had written about this place decades earlier. What Liz experienced firsthand exceeded her worst expectations. From being tied down to a bed in enforced isolation to being provided filthy water to drink and rancid bread that was nothing other than dried out dough. The place was crawling with rats. There were dirty linens and no warm clothing. Ice-cold baths were administered in a manner akin to waterboarding, with nurses dumping buckets over patients, the same dirty water already used on others. While there, Liz engaged in conversations with other residents and concluded that many of the patients there were every bit as sane as she was. Her analysis, of course, didn't carry weight with the staff since they had been fooled into believing that she was incurably psychotic. After 10 days, the New York World newspaper sent an attorney to arrange for her release. Within days, Liz began writing an expose in a series of newspaper stories, later compiled into a book entitled 10 Days in a Madhouse, under the pen name Nellie Bly. Liz's reporting sparked the reform of mental institutions across the nation, beginning with the Women's Lunatic Asylum on Blackwell's Island. Through her work, Elizabeth Cochran opened the eyes of the nation to the cruelty psychiatric patients had lived under, many of whom were entirely sane. And that's her story. Wasn't that interesting? There are as many stories as there are people, and each one can be entertaining and maybe even something to learn from. They're even better when you can share the stories you hear with the people you love, especially kids. I'm Rodney Powell, and you're listening to the Everyone Has a Story podcast, a production of realmedia.us. If you can hardly wait for the next episode and want to make sure you don't miss anything, add it to your favorites. There are still more stories. We'll never run out. Meet you back here next time. Everyone has a story.